Page 317 continued. Modern novel. Para. The modern novel from 1990 to the present day can broadly be divided into three periods. 1. The first period, extending from 1900 to the 1918, includes such prominent novelists as Henry James, George Gissing, Gissing, George Moore, Rudyard Kipling, Samuel Butler, Arnold Bennett, John Galsworthy, H.G. Wells, and Joseph Conrad. By and large, these novelists follow the Victorian tradition of the novel, though newer trends are also visible. 2. The second period extends from 1919 to 1939 and covers the period between the two wars. The main novelists of this period are Somerset Maugham, D. H. Lawrence, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, E. M. Forster, Aldous Huxley, Dorothy Richardson, and Catherine Mansfield. It is during this period that, quote, the stream of consciousness novel, unquote, comes to its own. The third period is the post-war period from 1939 to 1960. The chief novelists of this period are Elizabeth Bowen, Ivy Compton Burnett, Joyce Carey, and Henry Green. Para. English novel before the war. A. The novel as an art form, Henry James, 1843 to 1916. Though an American occupies a distinctive place in the history of the English novel, Henry James, though an American, occupies a distinctive place in the history of the English novel. Though he died in 1916, yet he is a modern in many ways. Quote, in the history of the English novel, James holds a position analogous to Flaubert's in the French. Both strove to give the novel the aesthetic intensity of a great poem or a great painting, unquote, says Walter Allen. He was a prolific writer who has left behind him a number of novels, short stories, essays, articles, and critical tracts. The Portrait of a Lady and the Ambassadors are his masterpieces, in which, in the opinion of Walter Allen, he has achieved a classical perfection of form never before achieved by the English novel. Para. Henry James developed his theory of the novel in his famous critical work, The Art of Fiction, 1884. According to James, the main business of the novelist is to give his impression of life in such a manner as to create an illusion of reality in his work. In his view, the novelist is an impressionist competing with, quote, his brother the painter in his attempt to render the look of things, the look that conveys their meaning, the color, the relief, the expression, the surface, the substance of the human spectacle, unquote, stop. James believed that a novel should not be used for preaching or imparting moral lessons. Quote, to him, the novel was primarily an art form to be judged solely by artistic canons, concerned not with moral purpose, but with the objective and impartial presentation of the reality of life, unquote, says Albert. Para. Henry James departed from the Victorian tradition inasmuch as he paid no attention to the construction of his plots. He was essentially an impressionist and a psychologist, and as such he did not care much for the coherence or otherwise of his plots. There is very little action in the novels of James. Walter Allen rightly remarks, quote, it is not customary with him to round off plots, stop. Whether the novel is long or short, it is an episode, stop unquote. James is an quote intellectual unquote novelist and not a quote passionate unquote one. He is concerned more with the study of mental processes than with the emotions of the human heart. We feel the absence of elemental passions and sentimental emotions in his writings. Quote, mind stuff, stuff, he made the controlling background of his fiction, stop unquote, says Neil, Neil, stop, para. James was a great artist who, quote, incessantly experimented with technique, moving from subtlety to subtlety, from strength to strength, unquote, stop. With him, the form counted much more than the subject matter. In his view, quote, the fundamental difference between the amateur and the artist is in the possession of the sense of technique, that is, in its broadest meaning of the necessity of form, stop unquote. James was the first to adopt the technique of, quote, the stream of consciousness, unquote, which was developed later by James Joyce and Virginia Woolf. He evolved the technique of presenting his story, quote, through the consciousness of a single character, thus discarding the ubiquity and omniscience of traditional novelist, unquote, stop. He is the first of the Impressionists. To many readers, his novels appear, quote, long-winded or affected, unquote, or complex and intricate due to his technique of presenting the impressions or, quote, points of view, unquote, of a number of different characters. B. The realist George Moore, Moore, 1852 to 1933, was a realist, his aim being to paint life realistically. Page 318. In the view of Walter Allen, he took over the, quote, naturalistic novel, unquote, from France and tried to popularize it in England. He was an Irishman who early in his life came under the influence of Zola and Flaubert, from whom he learned the subtle art of presenting the reality of things in an impartial and impersonal manner. In his novels like A Modern Lover, 1813, Mummers, Mummer', Wife, 1885, Spring Days, 1888, and Esther Waters, 1894, he made a sympathetic study of the poor people and their miserable existence. His realism often grows morbid and oppressive, for his novels present a close and realistic study of the sordid side of human life, bringing to view the misery and suffering of the poor and the downtrodden. The sympathy of the novelist is always with those whose lot is to suffer. Para. George Gissing, 1857–1903. Gissing was essentially a realist. Like Moore, interested in the study of the poor people and their mean and squalid existence. However, he did not sympathize with the poor as did George Moore. He simply focused the attention of social reformers on the miseries of the undergo and the socially alienated. His pictures of the sordid and seamy side of life have been drawn convincingly. He exhibited a rare skill in his unflinching realism, concrete detail, and a graphic description of the poor in an urban industrialized society. But he could not achieve the detachment of Moore. He is subjective and often colored his accounts of the poor with his own personal experiences. His main works are The Nether World 1889, Grub Grub Street 1891 and The House of Cobwebs 1906. The Private Papers of Henry Ryecraft, Ryecraft, is autobiographical in character and presents realistic studies of the squalid and savage people whom he had personally known, but without much sympathy with their unhappy lot. However, he is more sympathetic to women. The range of his female characters is considerably greater than that of his men. This makes The Odd Women and In the Year of the Jubilee his most successful novels. Para C. The novel of social thought, Samuel Butler. Samuel Butler, 1835 to 1902, was one of the most original and belligerent thinkers of the 19th century. He was, the literary bad boy of the Victorians, whom he scandalized almost as badly as his namesake had scandalized the Puritans, and for the same reason, because he understood neither their idealism nor the moral earnestness from which it sprang. The earlier Samuel delayed printing Hudibras, Hudibras, for fear of consequences to himself. The later Samuel refused to publish his work, scornfully asking, quote, "What is the use of addressing people who will not listen?" Unquote. So it happened that he was not widely known or even, quote, discovered, unquote, until the Victorian age had passed into history, unquote, says W. J. Long. Para. The fame of Samuel Butler rests chiefly on three novels: Erewhon, Erawhon, 1872, and its sequel, Erewhon Revisited, and The Way of All Flesh, 1903, which is his best-known work. In these novels, Butler blazed a new trail which ran counter to the prevailing tendencies of the age. Quote, "At a time when serious novelists were accepting James's condemnation of the omniscient author, Butler's book, The Way of All Flesh, was dominated by his opinions and prejudices. When other novelists were attentive to form and structure, Butler's book sprawled over several generations and suffered a major fracture halfway through. When other novelists were depending upon accumulation of detail and imitation of colloquial speech to produce the illusion of reality, Butler often contented himself with basic summary of both scene and conversation, unquote, according to Lionel Stevenson. Para. Butler exercised considerable influence on the younger novelists who were bent upon floating Victorian taboos and conventions. Quote, Butler carried the assault into the citadel of entrenched respectability by insisting that the self-righteous Philistines (Victorians) were themselves cruel, greedy, stupid, and hypocritical, and above all that the most cherished stronghold of Victorian morality, the family, was a machine of sadistic tyranny that perpetuated these evils from one generation to the next. As a scientific rationalist, Butler subjected the sentimental sanctions of the home and parental love and filial duty to a chilly anthropological scrutiny, and as an evolutionist he traced the ancestry of his central character to show how the dominant was all the more true by being reinforced by Butler's antipathy to Christian faith in general and the Church of England in particular. His vengeful sense of outrage prevented his book from being an impartial array of evidence and gave it a demonic energy that no reader could ignore, unquote, says Lionel Stevenson. Butler is an original thinker and a great iconoclast, though not a great technician. Page 319. D. The Romance of Indian Life, Rudyard Kipling, 1865 to 1936, was a prolific and versatile writer. He was a poet, a journalist, a novelist, and a teller of tales. He was both a realist and a romancer. He was a realist in his setting and character, which are, however, romantically treated. Realism is the basis of his romance. He is an impressionist whose pictures of reality are colored by his own personal impression and so are tinged with romance. Instead of fiddling romance in the past and the Middle Ages, he finds romance in the present realities of life. Quote, "He is the romancer of the present, of the modern social order, on which shines from afar a light as resplendent as that which shone on medieval society, for it is the same light of the imagination." Kipling feels the presence of romance in shot and shell as well as in bow and arrows, and in red coats as well as in buff jerkins, jerkins, unquote, says W. L. Cross. Para. Kipling was an imperialist, and his tales are so many glorifications of the British rule and British Empire. Quote, "His insistent proclamation of the superiority of the white races, of Britain's undoubted mission to extend through her imperial policy the benefits of civilization to the rest of the world, his belief in progress and the value of the machine, found an echo in the hearts of many of his readers, unquote, says E. Albert. This accounts for his contemporary popularity. E. The dramatic novel Arnold Bennett, Bennett, 1867 to 1931, was essentially a realist and a regionalist, and his realism is well brought out in the vivid and real pictures of the pottery districts of England or in his study of the Five Towns. The Old Wives' Tale, Clayhanger, and Imperial Palace are among his better-known novels. Quote, "The life of materialism is well portrayed in his novels. The internal economy of houses and hotels, down to their plumbing, food as bought, prepared and eaten, clothes and their fashions, means of transport, indeed all the machinery, equipment and paraphernalia of living claimed Bennett's absorbed interest, unquote, according to A. S. Collins. Bennett became an interpreter of the life and society of a particular region, the Five Towns, which he knew well. But it is to his credit that, like a true artist, he maintained an air of impartiality and detachment in the presentation of the life of this region. He did not aim at any propaganda or moral preaching through the medium of his art. A charming Dickens-like humor plays over all and makes the reading enjoyable. The impression of drabness, dullness, and sordidness that might be created from the study of his realistic pictures of the life of Five Towns is further removed by his addition of romance, especially the romance of love. Besides finding romance in love, Bennett, like Kipling, finds romance in the ordinary things of life. He refused to identify romance, quote, with the merely picturesque or the merely extraordinary, unquote, stop. God had endowed him with the ability of, quote, evoking the beauty and romance of the ordinary lives of ordinary folk, and it is one of the most attractive features of his best novels, unquote, stop, para. F. Sociology and Scientific Fantasy, H. G. Wells, W-E-L-L-S, 1866–1944, was a prolific writer and thinker who produced novels, pamphlets, histories, stories, and romances with unceasing regularity. He had his own ideas about the nature and function of fiction. For him, the novel was not a mere matter of relaxation and entertainment. He considered it as a powerful instrument of moral and social suggestion and propaganda. In his hands, the novel became an instrument of social, political, and educational discussion, criticism, and reform. Para. His novels such as The Time Machine, The Invisible Man, The First Man in the Moon, The Food of the Gods, and The Island of Dr. Moreau, M-O-R-E-A-U, deal with scientific subjects in an imaginative way. The imagination of the novelist is fired by some scientific invention or discovery, and he proceeds to explore imaginatively its full significance. The result is a delicious fantasy. All the possibilities of contemporary science are imaginatively brought out. Para. H. G. Wells did not remain in the world of scientific fantasies for long, and soon drifted away from the world of scientific dreams to the wider field of social life. He became a social critic and attacked social evils with the vehemence of an inspired reformer. In the history of Mr. Polly, P-O-L-L-Y, he exposed educational impostures, and in Tono Bungay, T-O-N-O, B-U-N-G-A-Y, he attacked modern commercialism. His method as a social reformer is different from that of Charles Dickens. Whereas Dickens attempted to gain his objects of social reform through persuasion, Wells adopted a more aggressive attitude. Writes A.C. Ward, quote, when Wells laughed at abuses, he was a second Dickens, semicolon. When he grew fretful over them, he became a second-rate edition of himself, stop. And he was perhaps the first of that army of propagandist writers, page 320, that, more particularly in the 1930s, endeavored to hector, H-E-C-T-O-R, rather than to persuade and convince, stop, unquote. G. Para. Joseph Conrad, 1857–1924. Conrad is a curious phenomenon in the history of the English novel. He is the solitary instance of a foreigner who wrote works of genius in the English language. He was a Pole by birth. He did not know a word of the English language till he was over 20, and yet he wrote in English with distinction, and felt that if he had not written in English, he would never have written at all. He was the contemporary of such traditional novelists as Arnold Bennett, H. G. Wells, and Galsworthy, and yet his work is entirely different from theirs. He is a great technical innovator. H. Cosmopolitanism and Renunciation. Somerset Maugham, S-O-M-E-R-S-E-T, M-A-U-G-H-A-M, 1874–1965, is one of the prominent novelists and short story writers of the modern times. The Moon and Sixpence, Of Human Bondage, Quetzalcoatl, and The Razor's Edge are among his masterpieces. These novels bring out his interest not only in his own country but also in other countries like Italy, France, India, and the South Seas. The settings of his novels are cosmopolitan. They are not confined to any one country or climate. Para. Mom is interested in three problems: the problem of renunciation and materialistic craze for possession, the problem of love and the human predicament, and the futility and meaninglessness of human life. In his view, renunciation of worldly power and PELF, P-E-L-F, is the ultimate solution to all our problems, cares, and worries. In his treatment of love, Mom presents the tragedy of love rather than its triumph. Love does not come out successful and happy in his novels. Everywhere we come across the tragedy of love. Life seems to Mom, quote, a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing, stop, unquote. Of human bondage is his final judgment on the meaninglessness and loneliness of human life. Quote, it is one of the most moving accounts of loneliness in our language, unquote, says Walter Allen. Para. Mom's greatness lies in his thought. As a thinker, he is original and provoking. He makes us think about life and its problems. He gives jerks to our self-complacent ideologies and forces us to view life in a philosophic way. He convinces us that, quote, art, unless it leads to right action, is no more than the opium of the intelligentsia, stop, unquote. Para. I. Symbolism. E. M. Forster, F-O-R-S-T-E-R, 1879 to 1970, is one of the prominent novelists and short story writers of the modern age. Quote, as a novelist, Forster is rather difficult to understand, partly because of the symbolism that works its way through his work, and partly because of the manner in which he seeks to impart his message. Stop. As a novelist, he is often delightful and always baffling and ambiguous, and he has always stood apart from his contemporaries, unquote, says Walter Allen. Passage to India is his masterpiece and his best-known novel. Para. E. M. Forster is a symbolist, and what could not be expressed adequately through words is suggested by Forster through symbols. In The Longest Journey, Forster employs the symbol of the train, representing salvation and the passing away of evil and wickedness. In Howard's End, Howard''S, END, motor car is the symbol of the rush and recklessness of modern fast-moving civilization. It is a symbolic indictment of our civilization with its feverish rush and activity. In A Passage to India, the symbolism is represented in the very title. Quote, passage, unquote, is symbolic of, quote, link, unquote, or, quote, connection, unquote, and by giving the title A Passage to India, the author advocates a link or connection between the Anglo-Indians and the natives of India. Glenn O. Allen is of the view that the threefold division of the novel symbolizes three attitudes towards life: the path of activity, the path of knowledge, and the path of devotion. Forster was a social critic and reformer who used symbolism as a means of his social purpose. In so doing, he added poetry to the English novel. Para G. Impressionism and Symbolism. D. H. Lawrence, 1885 to 1930, is one of the most disputed geniuses in the history of the modern English novel. He has been excessively praised as well as excessively abused. His preoccupation with sex has resulted in his being condemned as a sex maniac, and there are many who still regard him as a turner out of cheap sex novels. His novels like The Rainbow and Lady Chatterley's Lover were prescribed on grounds of immorality. His Sons and Lovers was condemned as a mass of sexuality and mother love, and the controversy raised as a consequence has come in the way of a fair and impartial assessment of his worth as a novelist. Para. Aldous, Aldous Huxley, Huxley, 1894 to 1963, is one of the most subtle and intellectual of modern writers. Page 321. His works present satirically and the disillusionment and frustration with contemporary social life. Chrome, Chrome, Yellow, 1921, his first novel, quote, is something of a youthful firework display, stop, unquote. Point Counterpoint, 1928, is a serious novel representing satirically the conflict between passion and reason and the foolishness of sticking to only one point of view without ever caring to look at the other side of the picture. This novel adopts a special technique which may be called, quote, the musicalization of fiction, unquote, stop. It is rich in witty and satirical epigrams. In The Brave New World, 1932, Huxley satirizes a scientific utopia in which everything is controlled and conditioned by considerations of scientific uniformity. The severe critic of this scientifically organized world is the savage John who pleads for greater freedom of the individual and for spiritual life. The satire lies in the fact that he fails to persuade the inhabitants of this scientific world to live up to his ideal of a free spiritual life. Para. Huxley is a novelist with a mission and a message. In Point Counterpoint, he lays emphasis on synthesis and harmony between sense and reason. In Eyeless in Gaza, we have the message of non-attachment. He does not mortify the flesh. He lays emphasis on the fact that the spirit is determined by the body. He says, quote, sooner or later very soul is stifled by the sick body, sooner or later there are no more thoughts but only pain and vomiting, a stupor. Stop. Apustupor. The spirit has no significance, there is only the body, stop, unquote. Huxley will always live as a thought-provoking and stirring writer of our times. Para. The Stream of Consciousness novel. The Architects. The, quote, Stream of Consciousness novel, unquote, is the peculiar product of the 20th century. The rise of this art form on the eve of the First World War marks an epoch in the history of the English novel. This particular kind of novel is also called the novel of subjectivity or the psychological novel. The phrase, quote, stream of consciousness, unquote, was first used by William James in his Principles of Psychology 1890 to denote the chaotic flow of impressions and, quote, sensations through the human consciousness, stop, unquote. Dorothy Richardson in England, James Joyce in Ireland, and Proust in France are the chief architects of the novel of subjectivity, and Virginia Woolf is the novelist who imparted form and discipline to it and thus made it popularly accepted art form. Para. We have mentioned above the name of William James, who coined the phrase, quote, stream of consciousness, stop, unquote. However, the, quote, stream of consciousness, unquote, novelists are much indebted to Freud, I beg your pardon. However, the, quote, stream of unconsciousness, unquote, novelists are much indebted to Freud, Jung, and Bergson than to James. Freud's theories of collective unconsciousness and myth and archetypes, archetypes, and Bergson's of the subjectivity and relativity of time, created around 1914 what Allen calls the right, quote, environment of ideas, unquote, which nurtured the stream of consciousness novelists like Joyce and Virginia Woolf. Dorothy Richardson, who made use of the technique in her series of 12 novels, Pilgrimage, is not an outstanding name for the reason that her psychology is largely pre-Freudian.